While people are settling down, uh, good evening to everybody, and good morning, good afternoon to people who are joining us online um, from many different places. I think we had a lot of registrations online from different parts of the globe. So that's great. So welcome everyone to the University of East Anglia and to this fourth annual John Innes Foundation lecture. I actually can't believe that it's the fourth one already. I'm honored that we have such an eminent speaker for our lecture today in Professor Jessica Fanzo, and I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us for this event. You are all warmly welcomed. So first, just a few brief words of housekeeping for those who are in the auditorium. In the event of an emergency, there are 3 fire exits which are clearly marked. I hope there's nothing planned for this evening. Toilets are on the other side of the foyer on the left. And we have lots of volunteers with badges who are available for any other requests. We have a wonderful young team of interns who are helping us with social media and communications. They might be taking a couple of photographs. So if anybody really objects to a photograph, please let me or Natasha, who's everywhere, know that you would not like to be photographed. So to start today's event, I'll just say a few words to introduce myself and the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development and our sponsor, the John Innes Foundation. I'm Nitya Rao. I'm professor at the School of Global Development at the University of East Anglia and also director of the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development. Founded in 2020, late 2020, the NISD is really, the vision is to be a center of excellence, which applies world-leading transdisciplinary research to pressing global problems. We have been trying to harness complementary strengths across the Norwich Research Park and focus on food security and sustainability to start with. This is an internationally recognized strength here in Norwich. So the institute itself was launched in early 2021 with generous funding from the John Innes Foundation, a UK-based charity which is passionate about the role that science has to play in creating the sustainable societies of the future. I would like to thank the John Innes Foundation for their financial support to the Institute and for their ongoing encouragement, advice, and wise counsel. I'd like to thank Professor Fanzo, of course, for honoring us today and being here with us today, and also my team at the NISD and colleagues at the Quadram Institute for all the work that has gone into preparing this event. So I'd first like to introduce our host for this evening's lecture, Professor David Maguire, the Vice Chancellor of the University of East Anglia. Thank you for hosting this lecture, Professor Maguire.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for joining us, whether you're here in the auditorium or you're joining us online from somewhere in the world. It really is a great pleasure on behalf of the university to be hosting this annual lecture. It's a very prestigious event, and we're particularly pleased this year to have attracted a speaker of such eminence. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Jess Fanzo to the University of East Anglia, but also to the Norwich Research Park, the greater entity of which we are a part, along with the hospital and the 4 world-class research institutes. I'll allow others in a moment to introduce Professor Fanzo in detail, but I did just want to take a moment to applaud all of your transdisciplinary work. That approach, I think, is so incredibly important for studies in this area. I personally believe, and I'm a very strong advocate, that collaboration and seamless working between different disciplines is essential if we are to address some of the pressing global challenges that face humanity today and in the future. However, I do also recognise that putting transdisciplinarity into practice, as our speaker does, is not always entirely straightforward. Here in Norwich, one of my priorities is to support our world-leading centres. They include centres of research excellence in climate science, in food and agriculture, and in global development, to support them so that they can work ever closer together for the global public good. As has been said, Today's talk is the 4th annual John Innes Foundation lecture, and I would also like to add my enormous thanks to the John Innes Foundation for their generous support in establishing the Institute for Sustainable Development here in Norwich, and also wider than that, all of the great work that the foundation does across the campus and the Norwich Research Park. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I am very confident that we have an interesting and thought-provoking evening ahead of us. And thank you, Jess, for coming across the pond to see us.
Thank you so much, Professor Maguire. I would next like to introduce our sponsor, Mr. Peter Innes. He's chair of the John Innes Foundation. And Peter has been, as I said earlier, a strong supporter of the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development from its very beginning. Welcome, Mr. Innes.
Thank you, Nidja. Thank you so much. Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this 4th annual lecture. Can I just say something about the foundation for those of you who aren't familiar with us? It's a charity that was set up as part of the bequest of my ancestor, John Innes, well over 100 years ago now. And since our formation, the foundation has supported the cutting edge research and cutting edge research. And today we find ourselves in Norwich on a unique site globally for research in the areas of environment, food, agriculture, and human health. The foundation believes that by encouraging these research communities to work together, we can address the most difficult challenges that the world faces. For that reason, we are enthusiastically supporting the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development and would very much like to continue doing so. It's my pleasure too to welcome Jess Fanzo to give the John Innes Foundation lecture today. Her work at the intersection of climate, food, and agriculture could not be more relevant to the aims of the foundation and could not be more important for our sustainable future. So thank you, Jess, thank you for honouring us today, and thank you all for participating. I'm sure it's going to be a most enjoyable event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'd next like to introduce the co-host of today's lecture, Dr. Maria Traha of the Quadram Institute Biosciences here in Norwich, across the fields, a part of the larger Norwich Research Park. And Maria is the head of the Food and Nutrition National Bioscience Research Infrastructure, I don't want to get it wrong, and co-director of the UK Food Safety Research Network as well. She has been closely linked with the NISD in our food-related research.
Thank you, Nitya, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to introduce our great speaker. On behalf of the Quadram Institute, I am delighted to be co-hosting this 4th annual John Innes Foundation lecture. For those that are not familiar with Quadram Institute, we are in the park. We're based here on the Norwich Research Park, and we bring together researchers, academics, and clinicians to address global challenges in human health, food, and disease. We seek to understand how food and microbes interact to promote health and prevent disease. And we use this understanding to develop evidence-based strategies and maximize the positive impacts of food on health. In that way, we can address key challenges both for now, but also for the future. The Quadram Institute was a founding partner of the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development, and we strongly believe that the transdisciplinary approach, like my predecessors were talking about, is essential if we are to address global challenges in human health, food, and disease. I know that our speaker today would wholeheartedly agree with that approach. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Jess Fanzo to give the John Innes Foundation lecture today and to spend time with us in the Norwich Research Park. I wish you all a very interesting and thought-provoking evening.
Thank you, Maria. And I think now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our John Innes Foundation lecturer today, Professor Jessica Fanzo. Professor Fanzo is Professor of Climate and Director of the Food for Humanity Initiative at the Columbia Climate School in the US. Her research focuses on the transdisciplinary field of food systems and the linkages between agriculture, health, the environment in climate-impacted countries that have limited resources. Jess has more than 20 years of experience working across the world, actually in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, on the diversity and quality of diets. That's been her main focus, nutrition and health outcomes, environmental sustainability, and climate adaptation. So very wide range of things. She currently leads the development of the Food Systems Dashboard and the Food Systems Countdown to 30 initiative in collaboration with the Global Alliance of Improved Nutrition. Jess has participated in very many, numerous other collective endeavors. I don't think I can recount all, but it has been more recently the Food Systems Economics Commission, in which Professor Barbara Harris-White, who's here, was also a member. The Global Panel of Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition Foresight 2.0 report, the Lancet Commission on Anemia, and the Eat Lancet Commissions 1 and now 2. She was also the co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report and team leader for the UN High-Level Panel of Experts report on food systems and nutrition in 2017, which was actually a landmark report which first set out the food systems framework. Before joining Columbia, Jess was the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food Policy and Ethics and the director of Hopkins Global Food Policy and Ethics Program. She's also held positions at the UN FAO, Biodiversity International, and the World Agroforestry Center. She has authored over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles, and they continue to come, 6 edited books, and over 30 book chapters. Today, she's going to speak to us about the importance of evidence and data to hold a spotlight on food systems. So she's going to speak first, and Jess will take questions after the lecture. So for those in the lecture theatre, please raise your hand or if you would like to ask a question. And for those online, please type your question directly into the chat function of Teams, and we'll pose as many as we can. Jess, over to you. We await your words.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks so much for coming. First, thanks to Nitya and NISD for hosting, along with Maria Traka at Quadram Institute. Thank you to the Vice Chancellor, he's probably a very busy person, for coming. And of course, to the John Innes Foundation and for Peter for coming. And thanks to all of you for taking time out. It's nice to be here in Norwich. I was corrected when I went through the border. I said I'm going to Norwich, and I got an evil eye from the border patrol. So it's wonderfully peaceful here. I just came from Columbia University. I'm sure some of you have been following in the news how contentious it is to be on U.S. campuses right now. So it's quite peaceful right now. And really glad to be here and take a little time away from the US. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'll stop myself, on the importance of evidence. And I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room how important evidence is, but you'd be surprised at how many people are doubting that importance of evidence and how it can shape food systems. Okay. So let's start first with food systems. And this is not a pretty diagram, I know, but it really captures some of the complexity when we think about food systems. In that gray box in the middle are the components of food systems. We have food supply chains. Foods are produced on landscapes. They're stored, they're processed, they're packaged, they're transported to markets. We as individuals, those green sets of boxes in the gray, interact with the food system every day. You engage and make decisions every day in the food system. You probably, hopefully, don't interact with the health system every day, but every day you're making a choice in the food system. You bring with you your decision-making power, your willingness to pay, your aspirations. And we engage in what we call the food environments. This is the places where you purchase or make orders of your food. These food environments are very diverse. They can be corner stores, they can be supermarkets, they can be a farm. And these food environments, what kind of food is available, what's the vendor, what's the products that are on sale, all of this is influencing what we call behaviors and your diets, the quantity, the quality, and the safety of those diets. And if you look over here to the right, we want a lot from our food systems. We want them to be doing a lot of things well. We want them to be environmentally sustainable. We want them to produce healthy diets for better nutrition and health. We want them to have and generate fair livelihoods. And we want social equity to come from our food systems. But on the left are all these drivers, many outside, exogenous to the food system, that are shaping and shifting food systems in different directions. Urbanization, climate change, population pressure, migration, politics, you name it. There's so many drivers that are influencing how food systems behave. So when we think and we look at this diagram of food systems, not only are there many activities at the global to the local scale, we have many different types of actors from the global to the local scale. So getting a handle on this food system, whether it be global or local food systems, is incredibly complex. So there's been a lot of attention put on food systems. And more, there's this idea that we need to transform food systems in positive directions. They're not working for everybody, everywhere, all at once. So how do we start to move towards more sustainable food systems that are working for everyone? And what makes it even more complex is now we have climate variability and change barreling down on us that is significantly impacting food systems and more of an urgency to transform them. So I'm going to walk you through a few slides of why we need to transform our food systems. And then I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing at the global to the local level. So some of you know, and I don't need to probably say this to this audience, but we are in a climate crisis at the moment. This is a paper that comes out every few years by Ripple and colleagues showing you the state of the climate. And it's never an uplifting paper that comes out. What we see here along the top are the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, of course, all increasing over time. This is showing you since the 1980s. And we see, of course, global temperatures rising. And there's a whole other range of climate signals that are signaling that the world is not doing well, whether it's increased acidification of oceans, deforestation, ice masses in Antarctica, the Arctic, Greenland ice masses declining, you name it, the world is stressed. The Earth systems are incredibly stressed. And climate change will and is having impacts on our ability to grow food. This is some work by colleagues at Columbia University, the AgMIP group that models out 20 to 50 years, the impacts and yields of major crops, in this case, maize, wheat, soybean, and rice. And this is showing you latitudes. The orange is yield decline. So you can see maize declining in yields, where the gray is showing you where the optimal growth of these crops is at the current state. And the blue is showing you yield increases. Wheat will do better in northern latitudes. And soybean has somewhat of a mixed effect, better in northern and deeper southern latitudes, and a little bit declining in the middle region. and rice having variable effects. This is model data. It's very uncertain, but there's estimates that crops will react differently to different temperatures in different parts of the world. And it signals this idea that maybe we need to be thinking about where we grow crops, how we grow them, what's the technology to improve on these crops, along with a whole host of other crops that are less researched. There's also modeling, again, looking at the impacts of concentrated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and its potential impacts on the nutritional quality of crops. These are crops looking at wheat, rice, maize, barley, soy, potato, and a couple of vegetable crops. In a business as usual, we could see declines in the nutritional composition of some of these crops. This is showing you iron and zinc and where the most deficiencies will happen across the planet. And this is a little bit of an alarming modeling exercise because iron and zinc are already key nutrients that are difficult to meet, particularly in low-income settings where animal source foods and other foods are less available. Now, so climate is potentially going to further impact food systems, but we also know in the now we have climate-related extreme events. Weather events are very front and center. Last year was the hottest summer on record, and will probably be the coldest summer you will have experienced. And we're seeing that all over the world. We're seeing wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, droughts. Are we prepared for the severity and level of these extreme events that are happening all over the world, high to low income contexts? This is some work by Quadram and colleagues looking at shocks that food systems face. And this is showing you crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture. And it's showing you on the top are the spatial shocks that are hitting food systems, as well as temporal shocks at the bottom. And these shocks can come in many forms. There's extreme events, climate-related weather, geopolitical, economic events, Ukraine-Russia crisis being one example, mismanagement, policy change, the US switching over to biofuels, for example. And what we see is that when we look at the spatial impacts of all of these varying shocks on these major areas of crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, the darker red is where you see more intensity of these shocks. And over time, on the bottom, the red signal you can see, with the gray being confidence intervals, you see there's more frequency of these shocks over time and more severe shocks. So are we ready to deal with this? So food systems are victims of climate variability and change, but food systems are also contributing to a warmer planet. When we look at this graph, it's showing you that overall, food systems are contributing about 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot. It's a lot for being such an ignored sector at COP. Most of that greenhouse gas emissions is coming from agriculture, on-farm productivity, not only cows from enteric fermentation, these ruminant creatures, four-chambered stomach creatures, burp methane, but it's also the handling of manure. Rice cultivation produces a lot of methane. Fertilizers produces a lot of nitrous oxide. And also land use change, deforestation, again, largely driven by livestock, the #1 driver of tropical deforestation. Most of the greenhouse gases from food systems are those two areas. The rest of the supply chain, packaging, transport, consumption makes up the rest of those greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not only the climate piece, but food systems are also contributing to environmental degradation. Major, if not #1 driver of biodiversity loss and extinction. Agriculture uses about 70% of all freshwater resources, and fish stocks are very limited or overfished. And I know this all sounds, I'm going to hopefully lift you all up at the end. This is a positive note when I look at this graph. 6 economies emit about half of the world's food system's greenhouse gas emissions. The US, China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, and the EU. Now, if you got those 6 economies to do something about their food systems, you'd make a significant impact on greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the mitigation potential of these 6 economies is really, really critical. So if these governments could step up, that could be critically important. Another reason to transform our food systems is that we're losing the diversity, the incredible biodiversity that we have on offer. We have over 5,000 crops that are potentially edible, but about 50% of our calories comes from a handful of crops: rice, maize, and wheat. 12 crops, including some animal species, the major ones, pork, cows, chickens, goats, and sheep, make up about 75% of the world's food. That puts us at incredible climate risk, incredible nutrition risk. And we saw when 2 major breadbasket countries went to war, Ukraine and Russia, that are producing mainly wheat, we saw a complete upending of the global food system. Food price increases, food inflation, a lot of market speculation. So maybe, just maybe, we're a little bit too dependent on a handful of crops and a little too dependent on a handful of countries producing most of the calories. Because when 2 of those countries go to war, you see the impacts on the global food system and food security. And what we've seen over decades and decades is a loss of these traditional crops. I know many of you, Peter's in the room somewhere, he works on a underutilized, forgotten crop. We're losing them. And this is showing you in these boxes. In the 1970s, much of Asia's landscape was growing these local varieties of diverse crops. And now, in the red, most of that landscape is growing the major varieties of what's consumed around the world. We can thank the Green Revolution for being very important in staving off massive famines, but we now need to move beyond that Green Revolution and start thinking about other crops that are important for climate resilience and nutritional health. And we know that the kind of foods that we are growing have different environmental impacts. This is some work that we did prior to the Eat Lancet Commission with Marco Springman, who sits at Oxford and the London School. And what we show is that when you look across different crops and animals, and that's shown you in the different colors of bars. So beef and lamb are here in blue. They have different environmental stresses. So on the top is greenhouse gas emissions. So animals, particularly ruminants, beef and lamb, produce a lot of greenhouse gases, as does some pork and poultry, milk. Now, when you look at other environmental stresses like land use change, fresh water use, nitrogen and phosphorus application, so eutrophication or pollution into waterways, different crops produce different environmental stresses depending on where and how they're grown and by who. So for example, in the United States, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, everyone is crazy about avocados. Avocados are everywhere. Big water footprint, grown in California and Chile, 2 drought-suffering places. Is it the best food to consume? Is it the best food to be growing in these places? We need to start thinking about the agro ecosystem where these foods are grown, and is it the most sustainable? Now, another reason to transform our food system is because the kinds of foods that are becoming available all over the world are these highly processed foods, or what are known as ultra-processed foods, or what we call in the United States, junk food. These are foods that are high in sugar, salts, and unhealthy fats. They have a lot of ingredients in them, many not recognizable, and we see a growth of these. And this is showing you over time, from 2006, projecting out to 2024, the range of these foods and drinks. sugar-sweetened beverages as well. And you see that there's a growth in the sales of these foods. Why? Well, they're really cheap to make. The ingredients are inexpensive for industry. They're easily traded across oceans. They can stay on shelves in hot environments for long periods of time. They're cheap to buy, and they're really tasty. So this is the conundrum. And these ultra-processed foods are significant contributors to detrimental human health outcomes. And the literature is growing significantly in this space. So this is a worry. And Nitya and I were talking that you go to the most rural areas of Africa and India, and these foods are everywhere. Now, on our diets, it's not only that we're consuming more and more of these processed diets, and maybe some of you have read that book, Ultra Processed People, or Becoming Ultra Processed People, but the kinds of diets we're consuming can have impacts on the environment. And this is work by Brent Kim at Johns Hopkins showing you a typical American diet, an omnivorous diet, consume a lot of meat. Here in red is the bovine meat, the cattle, beef, dairy. You see the greenhouse gas emissions are quite high, as compared to, at this last column, a vegan. So depending on the kind of dietary pattern that you choose, you can have a different environmental footprint. And the diet is a very important key piece for greenhouse gas emission mitigation. Now, what is this all leading to? Well, now diets which are meant to nourish us are now killing us. Diets have become one of the top risk factors of morbidity and mortality in the world. Isn't that incredible? So the die in diets is actually literal. And most of that death now is from non-communicable diseases, diabetes, heart disease, stroke. Communicable diseases is starting to come down, pre-COVID. We've been seeing a decline in communicable diseases, but a rise in non-communicable diseases in some of the lowest income countries in the world. And this is incredibly alarming. So some of these countries who are trying to get themselves out of a hunger undernourishment state are now being piled on with an overnourishment, non-communicable disease crisis, making it incredibly hard for countries to get out of. And what we're seeing now is the scale of malnutrition is universal and worsening. And food systems are critical for this, as are health systems, but food systems are the big problem, but also potentially the solver of this issue. We still have 735 million people who are undernourished or go to bed hungry. That number has been rising, not declining. We have 148 million children who are chronically undernourished or stunted. They're short for their age, but it's not just about height. I know you're all thinking this right now, my height. Stunting is more about your cognitive development. There's a window of opportunity to reduce stunting and get children on a linear growth. And if you do not act, it is incredibly difficult for a child to reach their full potential. 23% of the children under the age of 5 around the world are stunted. 45 million children are acutely malnourished, what's known as wasted. This number has not changed as long as I've been a nutritionist. It's been the same. And we're going to see more. And this number will change probably this year due to the Gaza conflict. 37 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, unheard of in the 1970s, and 2.2 billion adults are overweight and obese. And this is a map that just came out from the Global Network Against Food Crises, showing you the number of countries in immediate food insecurity crisis right now. And of course, these are estimates that come out. So we have a problem. And a question is, why has something like child mortality come so drastically down? We've made such inroads in that. But malnutrition largely has gotten worse. It's a question that needs answering. And the last reason we need to transform food systems, and this is really there's two messages from this slide. If we do nothing on food systems, we won't meet the Paris Climate Agreement. We won't stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The chances of that, regardless, are very low at this stage. But if we do nothing on food, we won't meet the Paris Climate Agreement. The interesting thing, though, is we have to do a lot of everything well. And when we say transforming food systems, we're calling for a grand scale transformation. It's not tinkering around the edges. So we need to change the way we grow our food, improving the efficiency, increasing yields in some parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa. We need to move towards a more plant-dominant diet, especially in places that consume a lot of meat, like the United States. I can criticize the United States because I live there and it's so easily criticized. We need to consume a healthy amount of calories, and we need to cut food loss and waste in half. And what this is showing here is that we need to do all of these well to stay below 1.5. But to fix this food system is incredibly daunting and complex, particularly for governments. So this is a more messy diagram of food systems and the interplay with global trade. But this is not an easy thing to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing. And I'll focus on 3 different scales. One is the global scale and some of the work we've done in framing food systems in the climate and international development agendas. The second is some of the national food system science and data work that we've been doing. And the third is really at the local levels, trying to understand people's ability to access healthy and sustainable diets. So on the global scale, it's interesting because international development is a very crowded space. Often food systems are not prioritized, particularly when you've got climate change, you've got wars, you have a post-pandemic economic downturn. But because of that, food systems are starting to be noticed and people are paying attention because food touches on all of these areas. So we're trying to work within these larger fora, whether it's in the COP meetings, in the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, the UN Food System Summit post-agenda, and other large global initiatives. And this idea and notion of food systems has been around for decades, and there's been many frameworks. And there's been ebbs and flows between prioritizing food security and then moving more towards a systems approach. And that's been in conversation for decades. And there's people in this room. Steve's been working on this. Barbara's been working on this. Nitya, a lot of people have been working on this notion of this holistic food systems. But more and more, it's become relevant in that food systems sit at the interface between human and planetary health. It's one of these tethering bridge areas. And what we've seen over the last several years is a whole slew of consensus reports in which many different experts and scientists have come together to try to provide guidelines to help policymakers, to help private sector towards thinking about what you can do to improve your food systems. And there's been a whole range of these reports that have come out that many in this room have contributed to. Some of the big ones and some of the controversial ones was the Eat Lancet Commission. Nitya and I are on the second one. Maybe we'll do it better this time, Nitya. I'm kidding, but sort of. But the Eat Lancet Commission was a very controversial report, but it was controversial in that it set up scientific targets for food within planetary boundaries. There's been a whole host of other evidence-based reports from Joachim von Braun and colleagues out of the UN Food System Summit, the Blue Foods Assessment at Stanford. And now coming up is further nuancing around building in justice and the economic case for investing in food systems. So we've been doing a lot of work at the global level. It's a very sort of thankless, getting lost in the ether sort of job, but I think over time it's culminated because of the thousands of scientists who've been working in this space. And some of the lessons that we've learned at working at the global level, when you have to work in consensus, is that if you flood the landscape with lots of reports and webinars and meetings, you can garner attention of policymakers. You got to just keep flooding them with information. But again, it can be transient and temporary. So while food systems have reached a higher priority, we're realizing that policymakers often don't know how to navigate such a complex system, the global food system, or even national food systems. And they're unaware of where to act and what are the potential trade-offs of acting. So more and more, we've been thinking about providing data is so critical for policymakers to help them navigate. We also know that while global governance matters for food systems, local context is key. Local governance, local solutions, investments for communities to really reap benefits. So while this global work is important for political attention, political will, political commitment, there's still so much work to be done at the very local level in your local food systems. So we started thinking about the data piece. How do we help decision makers in being able to navigate food systems? So we started to work on a couple of tools. We feel that policymakers are often in the dark on how their food systems are performing, what are the risks, and where to intervene. So we started to work in 2018 on something called the Food Systems Dashboard, and I'll show you a few slides of that, as well as the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. The dashboard brings together a suite of information really around that framework I showed you, where we tried to put data across that framework in a very logical way. And we mapped out drivers, we mapped out supply chain indicators, outcome indicators, and we designed this framework and this dashboard that allows anyone who goes to it to be able to describe a food system, diagnose a food system, and take decisions, what we call the 3Ds. And there's a lot of food system data tools out there. We have the Food and Agriculture Organization data tool called FAO Stat, but there's thousands of indicators and it's very hard to navigate. It's very hard to know how to enter into it. So we tried to make something really easy and digestible, very visually appealing. You don't have to be a data expert, pretty maps, pretty graphs. And we also developed what we call a diagnostic, in which it's not only describing food systems, but how are they doing? And what this is showing, this top set of box is low-income countries. The bottom is high-income countries. And we have about 39 indicators where we've set thresholds to those indicators as being challenging areas in red or doing well in green. And if you just look here at this last box, environmental outcomes, there's a lot of green here. Low-income countries are doing pretty well on their environmental metrics across their food systems. In red is high-income countries, not doing so well on environment. So for example, in the US, we produce a lot of greenhouse gases from our food system, right? A lot of biodiversity loss. So you can start to see how countries are doing, where they're doing well, where they're not doing well, and where they could invest and emphasize and act. So we do that on the dashboard. We've also been in a partnership with about 6 countries where we're developing subnational dashboards. So national dashboards for food, not so relevant. For some things it is, for some things less so. So we've been working, here's 2 examples of Indonesia and Nigeria, 2 very complex countries, very large, countries of vast diversity in culture and different food systems. And we've been building these subnational dashboards with their ministries of agriculture. And this has been really incredible because they've been mapping out what kind of data do they have at the district and local level, where they can really be able to take decisions at the local level. The other project we have is the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. And this is monitoring food systems at the global level for the next 8 years to the end of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what it is, it's about 65 scientists that came together, representing every region of the world from 32 organizations. And we put this group of scientists into 5 different working groups: diets, nutrition, and health, environment, natural resources and production, livelihoods, poverty, and equity, and 2 cross-cutting themes of governance and resilience. These groups, over a 2 or 3 year period, came up with a core set of about 10 indicators each that the world could monitor over the next decade. So what were the best indicators that tell how a food system is performing? And I know you can't see this, but these are the 50 indicators that we are tracking. And just to blow up one, this is showing you the diet and nutrition working group. Low-income countries are in light blue, high-income countries are in dark blue. And you can see less desirables to the left, more desirables to the right. For example, high-income countries are not doing so well on the cost of a healthy diet, whereas low-income countries are not doing so well on access to safe water, for example. So what it shows is that just because you're a high-income country does not mean you're doing well on your food system. We also show this by region. Again, just to blow it up, you can see diets, nutrition, and health. What regions are doing less well. So here's Sub-Saharan Africa on access to safe water, but Africa's doing better on the sales of ultra-processed foods as compared to North America. And you can also look by country and look how a country's doing compared to its region or by its income group. So it's a snapshot of a country of the 50 indicators. And so we're going to be publishing every year on this. We have a website as well and a policy report that comes out with it, with this peer review publication. But what we found through this food system science national work is that no single region, no single country in the world has a monopoly on food system success or on food system challenges. Not one. Every country, every region has significant room to prove, and they can learn from each other. We know that if the world doesn't monitor food systems, there'll be very little governing of those food systems. And that's why we're doing it. We've set up a 50 indicator framework for the world to start monitoring and governing their food systems, for the world to pay attention to food systems. The other big message from the countdown work particularly is there's so many data gaps of how food systems are faring during shocks, Ukraine-Russia crisis, COVID. Very hard to understand how the food system was behaving and what was happening to global trade, who was food insecure, what were some of the food access issues, why were food prices high in some places, not in others. We didn't have that data in real time to be able to help governments. So research becomes very important here. Now, the third area is really on local food systems. And again, this global national work is fine, but I think many of you in the room do research at a very localized level, or you're doing very groundbreaking basic science research. And that's so important. It's so important to get that context specificity. And some of the work we're doing is really trying to undertake field level research to understand how food environments are influencing people's access to a healthy diet. And we often work on what we call the natural food environments, and even more so, the wild food environments, the environments where people are relying on rivers, forests, deserts for their food. And that's changing. As the world transitions, we're still undergoing what's called a nutrition transition. People are moving away from depending on their environments, their natural outdoor environments, and people are urbanizing, and they're moving towards urban centers where they're no longer worried about what's happening in these wild environments. And the climate is really impacting these places. So some of the work we've been doing over the last several years, and there's a whole range of papers, and I'll share these slides for those who are interested, is when we think about what is a healthy and sustainable diet? Well, what does that mean in places like South and Southeast Asia that are going through rapid economic and nutrition transitions? They're becoming very urbanized. And we've been doing work in Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And we're really seeing that in rural and peri-urban areas, food access is changing in an incredibly rapid way. The way people get food, who's not able to access food, what are their mobility touch points. And it's an incredibly fascinating and dynamic space to work in. Some of the places we've been working is in Cambodia with riverine communities. The lower Mekong is highly impacted by climate variability and construction of dams up in China and Laos. And riverine communities in Cambodia are significantly impacted. Their food security, their ability to access aquatic foods, as well as other healthy foods that grow around rivers, the Mekong River, are all being significantly altered from one year to the next, from one season to the next. It's becoming difficult to do research because it's such a rapidly changing environment. We're also doing work with indigenous communities in India. This is led by Suparna Ghosh-Giraffe, who Nitya knows. She's been doing a lot of work trying to understand climate vulnerability of indigenous communities and how their food security is changing, how their sustainable agriculture practices are changing. Another snapshot of work we're doing is in Mongolia with herders, incredibly stressed. Many of these herders experience what are called zuds. If anyone has been to Mongolia, these intensely deep cold spells that kill a lot of their livestock. And a lot of the work we're doing is not really so much characterizing the landscape, but more of what are some of these herders' perceptions of a changing climate? Really important to get that local viewing, that local context. What are their local struggles to be able to help them in the near term? And across Mongolia, they're dealing with desertification, changing of seasons, heat stress, cold spells, winds and storms. This is an incredibly difficult environment for the Mongolian herder, a very incredible group of people who were at one point resilient, but the environment is taking its toll on their resiliency. Similarly, we do some work in northern Kenya with pastoralists, where we're looking at several different pastoralist groups, the Turkana and the Borana, very different status, the Turkana being probably the worst off. And here's the Borana down below. You can see they have guns. They're wealthier, more powerful. We've been working for about a decade now in this region, trying to understand their realities as pastoralists. And many of these pastoralists are abandoning that livelihood. They're leaving pastoralism. They all go and become security guards in Nairobi and Dar because they meet the height requirement. But this livelihood's being lost. They're politically and economically marginalized. And it's not just food and water insecurity for their animals and themselves, but more and more there's an intense land competition, not even amongst each other, that exists, but with the government. Kenya government is turning a lot of their land into conservation land for wildlife corridor passages. And that's cutting into what the pastoralists think is their land, right? So their land and their area to graze with the animals is shrinking. So we've done a lot of ethnography and photo voice in which we have pastoralists capture the situation that they're in over the last 10 years. So the lessons from the local context is that while global agendas matter to get the politicians on board, producing sustainable, healthy diets, ensuring that people have livelihoods in the food system is incredibly context dependent. And more and more, we're seeing that in resource constrained, climate vulnerable settings, there's significant challenges in people's ability to access healthy diets. Not only physical access or economical access, but social access as well. Social access being culturally relevant, freedom from social barriers and stigma. So stay tuned if some of you are interested in some of this work or collaborating. Really happy to talk more about this kind of local food access work that we've been doing. And let me just end, I'm almost out of time, on just a couple of slides about research. So I love this quote by Murakami. For those of you who are researchers in the room, maybe working on the little things as dutifully and honestly as we can is how we stay sane when the world is falling apart. It's pretty telling right now. It seems like the world is a bit on its knees. And several of us, when I was the editor of the Global Food Security Journal, we wrote a paper on a vision of what we want food systems research to look like. And, I have to say, I'm going to read this a little bit. At a time when facts and evidence are under ever greater scrutiny and sometimes even openly disregarded as suspect by some, we experience that a lot in the United States around climate. The rigors of science have to be maintained. So in my view, and there's been a lot of evidence to suggest this, that research has an incredibly vital role in charting a positive path for sustainable development. It can and does bring wholesale changes in attitudes, political thought, and action. I know sometimes it's hard to see that as a researcher, but building that body of evidence and that research can really make a big difference. The evidence on climate change that has accumulated over the last 50 years is incredible. In every country, with maybe the exception of one, depending on the political party, is on board that something needs to happen. Now, the next question is, are they going to act? And are they going to do it in time? But as researchers, we kind of keep our heads down. We stay quiet. We keep working on generating evidence for the greater good of knowledge. We hope that someone will read our peer-reviewed publications in that one journal and that'll make a difference. But you can't do that, right? You have to get your research out to a wider world. You can't just publish in peer-reviewed journals anymore. You have to get your information out. You have to speak in public. You have to sit at the policy table that politicians set, not the one that you think should be set. We have to start engaging and being global science citizens if we really want to make a big change in the world. And I'll just end with this idea that, and maybe some of you know Rebecca Solnit, who I love her work. And she has this quote, incremental change can happen quietly and change is rarely straightforward. Victories slip by unheralded, while failures are more readily detected. So while it seems like things aren't really changing for the better, they change. And we have a role to play in that change, in my mind. So people always ask me, am I hopeful? I always have to lie and say yes. But anyway, at least to my students. But I put hope on a different level. Hope is not the belief that everything is going to be fine. Hope is more about the possibilities and the basis for action and change. And to me, that's where we should go in the future. So I just want to thank, this is my core team who produces a lot of this work. An incredible group of inspiring early career scientists and practitioners. Here's some collaborators that we have on our Countdown initiative. We have a people-centered food systems consortium that's about human rights. I didn't bring that into the talk. Our pastoralist work and our dashboard team. My funding sources mainly from foundations, just so you all know, the UN. And thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone coming out and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jess. I think you've covered, huge amount of ground in the last 45 minutes. So while people are collecting their thoughts together, I think if people have questions in the room, please raise your hand and we'll give you mics. And I think, Peter, you're monitoring the online. Peter, are you monitoring online? So if there are questions online, then Peter will be on. Very good. Thank you. Yes, there's a. I think there's.
We are going to use the microphone, Steve. Yeah, you could say your name.
Yeah. Steve Wiggins from ODI. Jess, that was a tour de force, but can I pin you down a little bit on the rather changing narrative that I detected in that presentation? So you begin with these big systems challenges, and by the time you're 10 minutes, by the time you're 10 slides in, it's a reasonable reaction to this to say, right, we're absolutely stuffed. We've got no place to go here. These are really just overwhelming challenges. And I spend a lot of time grappling with arguments where I run into the T word time and time again, transformation. Usually not defined well as to what transformation actually means, sometimes actually misquoting some of the people who've actually done some serious work on transformation. So you begin from a position that worries me, where we have very big problems, and you start talking about big changes. And yet towards the end, on the last few slides, slightly to my pleasure, you start talking about little things add up to big things. So can I just ask you to come clean on that? Are you also in a world where you think a few marginal changes across a fairly wide landscape will sort things out, or do we need to be more radical than thinking in those terms?
I knew you were going to ask this, Steve.
Pick up 2 or 3 questions, or
Sure, that'll give you time to, yeah.
think.
I knew you were going to ask that, Steve.
So can we go to Anne-Marie? Okay, can we go Anne-Marie and then we come to Peter?
Thank you. Thank you, Jess, for some incredible work and an incredible presentation. Anne-Marie Menahan, Head of Nutrition and Preventive Medicine in the Medical School. It kind of follows on nicely from the previous question, actually. And, is there any merit in trying to simplify the problem by focusing on what is the worst thing about the human diet, or what is the worst component of the food system when it comes to planetary health? Now, I'm a human nutritionist, and the worst thing about the UK diet is carbohydrate quality. We don't have enough fiber, and we're eating too much sugar. I mean, could that be a starting point for change? You take that simple scenario and you look at the food system and you see how you could make that situation better using that as your starting point. And has there been any modeling around trying to simplify things and identifying what a meaningful starting point would be.
Come there. Yeah, and then Peter, could you, there was one hand before you, there at the back.
Pass this down.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks very much. I mean, might seem like a bit of a caricature of what you were saying, but the premise seems to be that if you provide all this information and all these data, then everybody's going to see the wisdom of a change of course. And I've been attempting that for a long time with GM crops, but that parenthetically. But you didn't use the word politics, although the word politicians might have crept in. So there's going to be a battle with, for example, the industrial meat industry, which is, I think to most people here, probably something of an abomination. But this is an industry with a lot of money to spend on advertising that will aggressively, is already aggressively defending its turf against moves to reduce the amount of meat in our diet. So I'd be interested in your assessment of what it's going to take to win that battle.
Thank you. Jess, would you like to take 3 by 3, maybe, questions?
Okay. These are all very difficult. So to Steve, who's always thought-provoking and he's such a great thinker. I mean, I don't know, Steve. I mean, I feel when you start to look at the range of food system challenge, in one sense, some would argue our global food system has worked efficiently well. I mean, when you start to look at disaggregate the data, that's not true. There's a lot of inequality in who gets access to what. But when you look at a macro scale, it's clearly not working well for everyone. And there's all these knock-on effects of certain decisions. So I think my point is that we need a massive transformation. And I'm not sure if we're going to get there, and I'll come to your point in a second. But that doesn't mean that we collectively, as the research community, where there's many of us, culminate a huge body of evidence. And a good example of that is the climate science community. There's been people diligently working on small pieces of the climate story that have culminated into a big story that politicians now pay attention to, or at least somewhat, right? So if you were to ask me point blank, macro or micro, I would say macro. We need big change. But it has to somehow trickle down to the most impacted and marginalized and vulnerable communities. And that sometimes I think gets lost. So that's where a lot of that global work to me, and then the local work in my own life, is completely disconnected. And I don't know how to always reconcile that, of how to make those touch points. But I mean, when I look at the data, and you can all tell me if I'm wrong, I'm worried about the future and if we're going to be able to sustain ourselves. I'm incredibly worried. So I think we need something to change in a very revolutionary way. That's my short answer to you, but we'll do more over a beer. On the simplifying, I completely agree. WHO does that a little bit. They have a couple of key things they work on, like salt reduction, sugar reduction, setting standards. And I think a good example is the trans fat story, the partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. In New York City, we had a Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who decided to ban it. And it was based, again, on strong evidence that trans fats are so detrimental to human health. And that has now grown into the WHO wanting to remove trans fats from the global food supply. One ingredient, right? Easily swapped out by industry. Palm oil, trade-off, right? A lot of the trans fat was substituted with palm oil, which is a tropical oil that is decimating biodiversity in some places. But that's a great example of something simple. Industry could do it. It could potentially have a big impact on human health. But there is an environmental trade-off to it. So I think sometimes with these simple things, there could be unintended consequences to them if you're not looking at a whole system. And this feeds in, when you were talking, I was thinking sugar, and this gets to your question. I didn't bring it up, but I do a lot of talks on the political economy of food systems. To me, this is the elephant in the room, how we deal with the power imbalances. For some of you who don't know the food politics, our global food supply has become incredibly consolidated and concentrated. There's a handful of traders, handful of processors, handful of agrochemical seed companies, and they completely dominate the global supply chains. Meat processors, 75% of that is controlled by 2 companies in Brazil. So I worry about the simplification of things and how you do that around some commodities like sugar or fat when you've got these power forces pushing against. Now, Nitya and I are on the Eat Lancet Commission 2.0. I was on the first one. There's lots of flaws in that commission. Hopefully, Johan and Walter are online. Anyway, the 2 co-chairs. But when that report came out, what we basically show is that if we move towards a plant-dominant diet, the global livestock sector would contract 65%. How do you think that went down? You know, I still get hate mail and death threats. I just got a call from the Washington Post yesterday asking if I could comment about the livestock industry's response to the Eat Lancet. I mean, these are incredibly powerful forces, especially in countries like the United States, incredible lobbying power, a lot of economic and political power behind these transnational companies. I find this so difficult to move beyond. And when you have governments whose hands are off the wheel and they are not governing their food systems, they are not doing good by their citizens on public health or environmental sustainability or farmers' livelihoods, and they're just letting food and beverage companies and the transnational ag companies largely govern those systems and make decisions about how food should work in their countries, I find that incredibly disturbing. So we're one little piece of this data piece. We hope that if governments can at least see where the challenges are in their food systems, if we actually can measure them, maybe they'll pay attention, or at least we can get civil society, the watchdogs, to say, look, this isn't good. Why are you not doing more on this, government X or Y? You know, so it's an accountability mechanism for us. So do I think that data is going to save the day? No, but I hope it's a nudge for governments to start paying attention.
Thank you. So let's go to a few online questions now. Peter?
Yes, just three online questions now. The first one is from Mari Franklin from JSE. In the diagnosing food systems processes diagram, do you see that high impact from high income countries correlates with high overall production in those countries? And then secondly, from Pan He, for mid-income countries where there are rapid dietary shifts towards meat at the moment, so countries like China or Brazil, what do you see as the most effective interventions or strategies to mitigate the externalities that come out of that? And thirdly, from Philip Taylor, when you gather data for the dashboard, how do you account for patchy data, for example, as the FAO is struggling with these issues when they put together data for FAO stat?
Okay, great questions. On the diagnosis, I didn't completely get the high production question.
So do you see the high negative impacts in high
In the
income
environment
countries
side.
to be primarily due to the high overall production there, or is it about the way that that production happens?
I don't think I can say that that's correlated necessarily, that it's just because of the high yields. Well, in the United States, for example, livestock emissions are high. We have low emission intensity per animal, but livestock emissions are high in general just because the US has so many animals, not compared to India. India has very high greenhouse gas emissions from their livestock as well, less productive animals. But I don't think we can necessarily say high environmental impacts due to high production, but I'm sure that can correlate with some places, but yeah, I don't want to say that in a blanket way. On middle income countries, absolutely, meat, animal source foods is increasing. That's very classic. As people get wealthier, they diversify their diets. They start to eat more luxury foods like animal source foods that they could not afford. People have the right to do that. We've seen huge growth in places like China for pork consumption. Chicken consumption has risen all over the world. So this is a normal thing to happen. Now, this is a complex question because in some countries, we want people to increase their animal source foods because they don't get enough, not even nearly enough. In some rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa, they'll eat a little piece of goat meat once a month because it's a wedding or a funeral, right? So these are very nutrient dense foods in very small amounts, particularly important for small stomachs for children. So, but there's a huge inequity, right? Americans consume 20 times more meat per day than in Bangladesh. This is just massive inequity. So how do we even that out? But overall, we're going to have to move towards less meat if we want the food system to generate less greenhouse gases, and that's the hard reality. While we can try to ensure that the livestock that we do have is produced in more sustainable ways, there's lots of potential technologies, better methodologies for more sustainable livestock systems that generate less greenhouse gases, particularly methane. Number one contributor to methane is livestock. Overall, we're going to have to come down. And I'm going to argue because we won't have a choice. It's going to get really hot. In many of these places where livestock is raised, these livestock will not survive. And that's going to be the hard reality. Mongolia's seen that. They just had a Zud, this cold spell. It wiped out the livestock population in Mongolia. It doesn't make the news because they're poor and poor people don't make the news, in a normal occurrence. But this is what's happening. It's going to get really difficult. And it kind of gets to the alt protein, lab grown meats, things like that. People always debate these. They're ultra processed foods. Are they healthy? Are they environmentally sustainable? Again, we might get to a point where we don't have a choice. If we want that flavor of meat that looks, bleeds, tastes like meat, we may have to consume those foods because there just might be less meat to consume on the planet, or it's going to be incredibly expensive. So we don't talk enough about the animal welfare piece and how hard it is going to be for herders and ranchers and pastoralists to raise these livestock on a very, very hot world with less water. We never really talk about that. So this demand for meat is going to go up, but there might be shortages, in my opinion. Dashboard, patchy data. So we have a whole criteria of the kind of data that we put on the dashboard. It has to be frequently collected, available in almost every country. Because you go to some food dashboards and you look and it's mainly high-income countries because that's where most of the data is. We don't do that. So the data that we have on there is we have a whole set of criteria. You can go to the dashboard and see it, but it's data that's collected around the world. Almost every country is represented, if not all of them, across all the 200 indicators, and it's data that is frequently collected. That was one of our criteria. Now we lose out on some key indicators, but that was part of our criteria for the dashboard.
Thank you. I think there were some more hands in the room. So Richard, first.
Richard Palmer-Jones, formerly of Dev and other places. Actually, you partly addressed my question, but not completely. And that was why there was no political economy at all throughout most of your presentation. And you clearly recognize how important it is. So to be constructive, I don't quite understand why you couldn't have a dashboard which reflect the amount of lobbying and the power of the major interests that are involved in the agricultural sector. I mean, back in the day, I used to take students to the Royal Agricultural Show, and I'd take them to the Central Ring, and I'd tell them to look about, and I'd say, now, who do you think makes money out of agriculture or food systems, things like that? And of course, it was the banks, was one of the biggest, because they lent money to farmers for working capital and fixed capital and so on. It was the agrochemicals, it was the manufacturers, it was other consultants and engineers and so on and so forth. And of course, as you've added on, there's the food industry, large farmer lobbies and so on and so forth. Is it beyond possibility to collect data that meets your criteria, that reflects the power of these and the influences these bodies are having? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions. One there. I think you had your hand up. Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. My name is Agnes, a postgraduate student in climate change and global development. My question is about the small steps that you're talking about. How about start at the point of supply chain emissions in the food systems? Because exporting chicken feet to China from UK, because that is where the demand is, or exporting mutton from New Zealand to USA because mutton from New Zealand tastes better. My friend was talking about that, and I'm thinking mutton from New Zealand to USA, and and it's more expensive, and people are actually buying it, and yet you can imagine how much emissions have to be emitted just to move product all over the globe when it's even present in that area. And lastly, where does culture come into play? Because I believe culture has a lot to do with maybe the reason why Asia feeds so much on fish, possibly, or why in Africa they decide to plant whatever kind of food they want to plant in that area, because that is the culture. We have to plant groundnuts, we have to plant cassava, we have to plant rice because of the culture around the place. So where does culture come into play here? Thank you.
And right there at the back, Satish, should we just take 4 and then close it? Yeah. Can you keep your questions brief? Yeah.
Hi, Jess. My name is Satish, and I am a postgraduate taught student in global social development. So my case is from India. So I'm working on local food systems. So I agree. The first point you were saying the transformative revolution is required. And I saw that in the fields. I saw from the fields. So my point, I saw the path in post harvest. A transformative revolution is required, where the inequality is happening in the incomes or the economics. So my question is, so before jumping into the research, I I saw this is required as an interdisciplinary research. So my point is like, so should I speak to other disciplines before jumping into the research, or should I do what I understood? So this is what the question is. I felt like joining 3 disciplines: economics, policy reforms, and food systems.
Thank you. Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about policy. Policy is very important to you and to food systems researchers. All policy is labelled. All bureaucracies are parts of states which are cut up in an architectural way between different areas of action. Nutrition, for instance, doesn't include alcohol, but where I do research in India, alcohol is very important for the nutritional status of a family. It's a good example. So my question is, why isn't the next step locally to make maps of the bureaucratic architecture that's relevant to a concept which is foreign to it, food systems? States are not arranged around food systems, they're arranged in ministries and departments. Why don't you cut up the very, very large number of policy suggestions that come out of food systems research according to the architecture of actually existing states?
Yeah. So probably we'll take a last question there in the middle, Jaheen, and then give Jess an opportunity to answer.
Thank you. I have two very short questions. One, I'm Jaheen. I'm a postgraduate research student at UEA, and I'm from Bangladesh. Thank you for using Bangladesh as an example to use. But a very short question. One is when you talked about radical changes, and you, I think, briefly talked about inequality. So inequality within radical changes, a system level change, how we're going to do with the actor who's in the system, who's already having challenges related to status quo, related to inequality. How would you, how can we deal with that? How can data and evidence support us to deal with those issues? And my second question is, I think it's around the food sovereignty of the farmers, the production sovereignty. We talk a lot about, and it's also market driven. The market plays the major role in what kind of food we are producing. Even in countries like Bangladesh, what kind of chicken are you growing? It's determined by a couple of big, large companies in Bangladesh. So how can, amidst these changes, how can farmers know, how can data support policymakers to ensure farmers' food sovereignty or production sovereignty? Thank you.
Wasn't a very small question.
Yeah. It's a political economy question again.
Yeah.
About the big companies.
Okay, so on the lobbying, in the data around lobbying, it's such a great idea, but we've tried to pull together a lot of different data coming from private sector, not so much on the lobbying, the funding that goes to lobbying, for example, but overall, it's very hard for us to get private sector data. It's all proprietary. It's all locked in. They're not going to share it. I would think that lobbying funding, I know for this in the US, getting this across countries would be really challenging. And that's very much under lock and key. Maybe I'm wrong, but and one thing that's important on the dashboard is the data is divided by country. Where you can see some data is the concentration of power across commodity. We don't have that on the dashboard, right? We're not divided by commodity. It's at the national level and what is the performance of. So you could say, well, it would be great to show the number of dollars of lobbying going to a country for livestock or sugar. I just have never seen that data across the world. And my question is, is that even available? Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a good idea. I like that idea. Okay, on the transport and culture, that was Agnes, right? Transport's about 10% of greenhouse gases. It seems like it should be more, right? Because food is moving all around the world, but transport has become quite efficient. So it seems like it should be a bigger contributor to greenhouse gases. But I think you're getting at another point of why are we moving these foods all around the world and not investing more in localized food systems? And this was a big debate during COVID. There was this idea that maybe we shouldn't rely so much on a globalized traded food system, and we should focus more on our own food sovereignty, back to the last person's question, more on local systems, more on local production. It works to a certain point. You know, I still want my Ethiopian coffee every morning, right? And I'm not gonna be able to grow that in New York City. I can't really grow anything in New York City because rent is $5,000 a month and there's no land to be had, right? So it's just insane, right? You can't grow food in a lot of these places. So we are very reliant on global trade. And we did a paper showing that if we removed global trade and moved towards very localized food systems, we'd actually see micronutrient deficiencies skyrocket. And that was some work that we did with Steve Wood and Ruth DeFries. So global trade and moving food around the world is important, but it needs to be done as environmentally sustainable as possible. But it doesn't contribute as much as you think it would. So this idea of local miles is a bit of a myth. On culture, very important. I think the big thing we don't want to lose is culture, right? We don't want to have this monotonous diet. And I would say one of the criticisms of the Eat Lancet Commission, let's say a misinterpretation maybe,
Yeah.
or it was not communicated well, was this idea that there should be diverse diets around the world and culture is so critically important, right? And I would even argue, we've done a lot of work in Timor-Leste on food systems, and there was a big push for more of these indigenous crops and moving away from the colonized foods like rice, and going back towards more taro and more of the local foods that were so important for them. And I think there's a movement now around indigenous underutilized foods, or what's being called opportunity crops. And we have colleagues in the audience from the Bioversity and Seattle Alliance, which does a lot of that work. What is this? Both. What's that question? What was the third question?
That was about interdisciplinarity.
Oh, yes, that's right. You need to do both. You need to, in my view, you need to be an expert in your space. You need to stay in your lane, as they say, right? But then you take that expertise and bring it into a multidisciplinary collaboration. But in my view, Nitya has an expertise. She's very famous for her expertise. I have a certain expertise. We come to the table as those experts and learn from each other. But it's hard to work multidisciplinary if you don't have a discipline. So I think you need to do both, right? And the hardest part about working multidisciplinary is learning other people's languages of their discipline. That is incredibly challenging. And it's incredibly time consuming to work effectively across collaborations, right?
Absolutely.
What are we doing? Why are you spending so much time on this stuff? Anyway, on the cutting up the policies according to the architecture, Barbara, amazing question. And I would say it kind of was done a little bit with nutrition. When nutrition was kind of having its moment in 2010 and the Sun movement had started, you can disagree with me, nutrition was seen as this multi-sectoral issue. And they tried to take the ministries of health, the ministries of ag, Ministry of Women, rural dev, urban, and say, okay, you're responsible for this Ministry of Ag, you're responsible for this Ministry of Health. And post-UN Food System Summit, they're trying to do it again. And they have these national food system conveners. I don't know, Barbara, if you're involved in any of this work. So they're trying to kind of do something similar. But I would argue that some of the attempts in nutrition, which there's been several, to work on these multi-sectoral planning at the local level in countries, hasn't worked so effectively because it ends up being budgetary issues around different ministries and who governs what and who has to take responsibility and who coordinates it. And just like you said, these bureaucracies do not fit with, they're not meant to work multi-sectorally. Their budgets don't work that way. Their leadership doesn't work that way. They're trying to do it again post UN Food Systems Summit. It would be interesting to see what happens.
So I think there's,
Yeah.
if I can just, while you're looking, I think the last question probably, though it's time to close, but I think there's somebody online with some urgent questions, Peter, which you wanted to ask. So just a couple, please. I think we've run over time a little.
Yes. I hope these can be answered fairly quickly.
Okay, do it quickly.
So one question from Sophie Constant. In terms of assessing just transitions in the food system, what do you think are the measures that can be used to identify progress on the fairness?
I can do that quickly.
Okay. Yeah, quickly.
More disaggregated data. When you look at data, you don't know, you get like urban, rural, male, female. You don't get disaggregation by tribe. You don't get any kind of disaggregation about figuring out who's marginalized, who's not. So if we can get better at disaggregating data, so we can, to the other question, better prioritize who's being left behind. But we don't have that disaggregation of data to really figure out who's marginalized, who's deprived, who's vulnerable. We don't have that disaggregation. So that's required, and we don't have it.
Thank you so much. I think probably I'll need to close it now. I'm sorry for the other participants who are online. But it's been a great talk and a great question and answer session. Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. We're going to have a